Hello class! Today's video is about adaptation in lifting and during the different phases of lifting. What does adaptation mean during the beginner phase? What does it mean during the advanced phases, during the intermittent phases, and maybe even during the elite phases, even though most people will never get there. And as this topic tends to be quite confusing for many people, I tried to illustrate most points graphically, so let's dig into the slides. Okay, first of all, a small comic or a joke to show you that adaptation is actually something really important. And as this, person in the picture proved to us, you cannot directly load the bar with, for example, 2 plates on the first day of squatting. Usually you have to undergo some adaptation for those weights. You have to progressively increase the weight until you reach that threshold of 2 plates, for example. You cannot just do it the first day. Okay, but let's first begin with a visualization of the adaptation ranges. The top line marks the maximum our bodies can adapt to. The bottom line marks the minimum our body needs to adapt by growing muscles. Anything between those lines is possible. If we train in a way that we are somewhere in this interval, we will achieve growth in either strength or muscle or something. If we do too little, we won't grow. If we are below the bottom line. If we are above the top line, we won't grow either. We will see some results at first, but those will fade soon as our body cannot regenerate anymore. We have to choose the right weights. If we choose too much, there's no way our body can adapt to it. The increments should be rather small, so our body doesn't really know that we are increasing the stimulus. And this is obviously for the very beginning, for the very first linear part of progression. After that comes typically another linear phase, but with a less steep incline, let's say. You can still linearly progress, but not as fast as before. And this interval of adaptation is rather huge. In the beginning it is really hard to make a mistake. Most people are too lazy to actually go above the interval of adaptation, and most programs that are commonly described or prescribed to people automatically make sure that you are somewhere in this range. And since this range is rather big, you probably cannot really make mistakes. If you are very careful, for example, or have fear of overtraining or something, you can be below this interval at this point, for example. If you increase the weight too slow, it is easy to be below this line. And if you are outside this interval, then you won't adapt. Okay. After that comes another phase. This phase is usually for advanced or intermediate lifters. The usual, procedure of linear progression does not work anymore at this point. You have to employ something that is called the mesocycle. You have to increase the weight periodically for several weeks, followed by usually a deload, which results in some kind of sawtooth curve, as we can see here. And this style of training can be repeated for several years until it stops working. But in this style you can probably accumulate enough training stimulus within 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 weeks, and then your body grows over the course of those mesocycles. After that comes a much more difficult phase, and this phase truly is much more difficult. When you are truly advanced or proficient or even elite, all those things become much more important as the interval of possible adaptation shrinks. It is very easy to go above the curve, and it is very easy to go below the interval of adaptation, but you have to stay inside. And since your regeneration as a human is limited, you have to make sure that you accumulate stress over one session, then regenerate just a little bit. And then, before you are fully regenerated, you have to start your next session and accumulate even more stress. And you have to repeat this for sometimes several weeks or even months on end. And then you make a deload at the end of this kind of cycle. And then you grow. And then you start the next cycle, but the starting point of the next cycle is slightly higher than the starting point of the last cycle. And in the end, this is all that gets repeated over and over for the really successful lifters. Sometimes they even employ cycles that are years long. Phases of 3 months where they follow a plan, then phases of another 3 months where they get more specialized, etc. But all those things have in common that they have a very, very narrow range of adaptation that only gets narrower the further you progress. The margin of error gets very, very slim the better you get. And as you can see, this whole thing looks like a saturation curve. You are approaching your genetic maximum very, very slowly, if it exists. But I'm pretty sure that it does exist. Somewhere around here. You probably won't get much stronger than that, but even approaching that line is very, very difficult. As you can see here, the incline of this curve slowly reduces over time. And at this point you probably have something like 5 years of training experience if you've done everything all right. Most people will never get here and will probably be stranded in this phase for all eternity without making much progress. Okay, but let's now have a look at the things then that can go wrong. If we look at this red line, this here is a person that wants too much. This person starts really, really heavy. And the problem with this approach is that it leaves you with nowhere to go. If you are employing very big increments, your body demands the very same increment or more the next time you go to the gym. So you pretty much have to follow this red curve, and at some point, even after a few months, you can't anymore, because your capability of regeneration will be exceeded. So at this point you will stall if you do too much, if you increase the weight by too much. On the other hand, if you increase the weight by too little, you will stall too, because at this point here, maybe after even 2 or 3 months, you will do too little to achieve any adaptation of any significance. So you have to be very careful to hit this interval. It is very easy at this point, after 3, 4, 5, 6 months, to do too little. The things worked before because this range here is rather big, and it is very easy to enforce adaptation as a beginner, but it gets much more difficult the further you advance. The range always gets narrower over time, and it's harder to achieve any form of adaptation in muscle growth. The optimal progression, however, is that you land in this interval somewhere. You can progress rather fast during the first section, let's say, during the first 3 or 4 months. Then you slow down the progress just a little bit, so you stay inside of this range, and then you go over to the more intermediate or advanced programs where the mesocycles come into play, and you you deload in a controlled fashion over several weeks and progress thus even further. Okay, that's pretty much it. So now to the summary. What are the takeaway points? Well, first, there's a range of valid training stimuli that leads to adaptation by muscle growth. And you, as a lifter that wants a nice body, wants to be inside of this range at all time. You want your body to adapt by growing muscles. If you go above those range, it leaves you without options, and you have nowhere to go anymore. You will stall, and at that point you have to deload and maybe start much slower than before to reset your adaptation of the body. Going too low, however, leads to no adaptation at all, since your body sees no need to grow any muscle, since the load is too light and it does not expect much higher loads to come. And over time it gets much more tricky to accumulate enough stress to invoke adaptation. You have to do more every time, just a little bit more every time. And that obviously gets harder over time, because the increments from 60 to 70 kilos aren't valid anymore, for example. So you have to train in a much higher rep range, do much higher tonnage, do different exercises or whatever. So you have to get creative. Arnold calls this muscle confusion, for example, to always provide something new for your body to adapt to. And after several years, you have to accumulate fatigue over sometimes months or years on end. For example, Martinez Licis trains in a way that he has several months where he only does light weights, where he increases his muscle size, and then he gets more specific over time. So his training cycle is almost a year long sometimes, if the competitions he has allows for it. And as always, there is both too much and too little, and you should aim for the interval in between and choose a steady but sustainable progress. If you do not do that, you won't make optimal gains. Well, yes, in theory you can progress at the top end of the curve, but the bonus of that is very minuscule and it's very easy to make errors. Okay, that's pretty much it for today. I hope you learned something and can put those tips into practice. If you feel like I missed something, feel free to let me know in the comment section. And if you liked the video, feel free to subscribe to the channel and leave a thumbs up. And until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.